Hello and welcome. My name is Mary and I'm the host of Prologues, a lifestyle podcast where each episode is like a digital journal entry detailing whatever it is I'm going through in life at the moment. I talk about my journey with mental health, relationships, wellness, beauty, personal development, and more. So join me every Monday morning for a reminder that we're all still figuring out life for the first time and you are still in the beginning of your personal story. Hello and welcome to another episode of Prologues. I feel like right now is a great time to have a 2025 catch up because we're a little bit more settled into the start of the new year. The buzz from the holidays and from New Year's has settled down, and so has the buzz from making resolutions. So how are we doing? I would say for myself, I've really enjoyed having my slow start to the year. I'm so glad that I've done that. And so far, I'm doing pretty well at sticking to the things I said I was going to do. So my hobbies are going well. The second episode of this season was all about how you need to find a hobby. So I thought I'd update you on that because it's really easy to get into a hobby quickly, spend money on new supplies maybe, or get fired up about it, throw yourself into it, and then lose interest. So I wanted to give you an update. I'm doing well. I've been committed to piano. I'm learning, I would say, at a decent pace. I'm making sure I spend 20 minutes on it a day. I feel like more than that, and I feel like I can't really commit to it because I like to do this in the morning, sort of right when I wake up. I feel like it helps get my mind going for the day. And every time I commit to 20 minutes, and then I've had multiple horse riding lessons and I'm improving there too. My legs get so sore every single time. I feel like my mindset to fitness has really changed this year because I've realized that in order to do the things I want to do outside of the gym, I need to be strong. So for example, in order to ride a horse, I need to have strong leg muscles. So that's one of my motivators whenever I do Pilates or I strength train. But still, my legs right now are so sore. I had a lesson yesterday. It's the good kind of soreness where you know you've done something great for yourself, but I'm in pain right now. But I'm proud of myself because that means I'm committed, I'm going, I'm sticking with it. And I have found myself spending less time on my phone. A few days ago, I spent less than 4 hours on my phone. That might sound crazy to some of you guys, as in still a very long amount of time, but that is half of my normal screen time. In fact, every single day this week, I've had a screen time that is significantly less than it used to be. And I'm crediting that to my hobbies because one, if I'm playing piano in the morning, that's something I'm doing right when I wake up that's not on my phone. And my horse riding lesson is only an hour, but every time I do one of these hobbies, I'm reminding myself of why I chose to have this be a defining word, a defining idea for my 2025. And it helps remind me to stay off my phone. So lowering my screen time and committing to my hobbies is going well. And that's sort of my start of 2025 check-in. I'm also really glad I had a slow start to the year and I've made a mental note because next January, I'm going to remind myself that this helped me a lot so I can do it again. I think my start to the year was fairly peaceful. I had very few social plans. I'm kicking things up a little bit more now that we're approaching, well, I don't know when this episode is going live, but we're approaching February, so a little bit more, but it still feels gradual. And then I think March is going to be my true month where I kick things into high gear. So I'm interested to hear from you guys how the start of your 2025 is going. I just wanted to give that little check-in. I also thought, because I haven't done this in a very long time, I would give a list of favorites. We are going to get in today's episode, which is lessons I've learned from my therapist, but I thought we could have a more chatty start to this episode. And I wrote down a list of favorites that I wanted to share with you guys. These are fairly specific as well. So my first favorite is the Working Hard, Hardly Working podcast from Grace Beverly, specifically episode 121, which is how to build true discipline and stay consistent. So I love Grace Beverly's online presence. I love her podcast. She approaches self-development and self-betterment from a perspective that really appeals to women. I feel like a lot of podcasts like hers, where she interviews CEOs, she interviews loads of business people, she talks about discipline, she talks about finance. A lot of those podcasts are geared towards men, very podcast bro type vibes. And I really appreciate that Grace has created a podcast that feels friendly and accessible and is marketed towards women, but is still covering all these topics that I find so interesting. And the episode I just mentioned, episode 121, is a solo episode. And what she's doing with her solo episodes right now is she's taking all the best bits of information that she's found, that she's heard about a topic through the guests she's interviewed in other episodes, and condensing them down into one shorter episode that's packed with useful information. So how she described it was, she's interviewed so many people, business people, CEO, that have talked about how to stay disciplined across the length of her podcast, but she's condensed all the best tips into one episode. So it's a shorter one. I think it's like 25 minutes long or something, but it is so helpful for me. I like the podcast in general, but that's one episode that I really love. My second favorite is a YouTube vlogger. I think a lot of us are getting back into vlogs right now. Her name is Hannah Adkins. She lives in the Cotswolds. She just posts very cozy, aspirational, beautifully filmed, very cinematic countryside content. If you're looking to start with any one video from her channel, I would watch the peaceful morning routine in the English countryside, and it was posted on January 12th. It is one of the most beautiful vlogs I've ever seen. I love the way she films. I love the way she color grades. I love how slow paced and peaceful the vlogs are. And I don't mean slow paced in a negative way. I mean, truly, it feels like I'm not even consuming social media. It's like switching my brain off, watching some beautiful content. It's an expander for me because, as you guys know, I really want to live in the countryside. I can't wait to get to that point in my life. And I believe she moved, and I don't know where she moved from, a city. She recently moved back to the Cotswolds where she was raised. I think she was living in Manchester, maybe. I'm not sure, but she's vlogging her journey going from a city back to the country, which is where she came from. So that's very relatable to me. But even if that's not relatable to you and your aspirations, the vlogs are just beautifully shot. I would recommend starting with that one. Let's see. My next favorite is another podcast. This is the Acquired podcast. Their tagline is every company has a story, learn the playbooks that built the world's biggest companies. These are hefty episodes. The specific one that I listened to and really loved was the Hermes episode. It was 4 hours long. It was all about the history of Hermes and how they've grown into such a luxury empire with very minimal marketing. Hermes has historically been an if you know type of brand. Obviously Birkins and Kellys and the Birkin game are huge on social media right now, but Hermes has been a brand that has not really relied on flashy ad campaigns to get their name out and to draw in new clients. And I found the episode to be absolutely fascinating because it was so long. I did listen to it on 1.5 speed. I don't like to do that, but I was like, I can't commit to a 4-hour episode. So I listened to it on 1.5 speed, but that episode and the podcast in general, I just thought were so fascinating. Let me look up more episode titles so you can get a sense of what they talk about. It's all about businesses and it's the history of businesses. So Mars Inc., IKEA, Meta, Ozempic, Visa, Costco, Nike, Porsche, Uber, Lockheed Martin. Most of the episodes are over an hour and a half in length, so they are quite long and they can be dense. But I think it's fascinating to learn about the history of these companies that we interact with all the time. Maybe not our mess, but the other companies, Uber and Costco, that we interact with all the time. So I love that one. My next favorite is decaf lattes. So as you guys know, I am someone who's extremely sensitive to caffeine and can't really handle it. And I feel like in 2024, I was trying to convince myself that I could handle caffeine because I was tired of not being able to handle it because I felt weak. And so I was trying to build my caffeine tolerance and I was drinking more matchas, more chais, and espresso, real lattes for basically the first time ever. And I have now come to the conclusion that, you know what? I just need to accept who I am. And that's someone who really can't have a lot of caffeine. Every single time I would drink a latte or whatever, and I would tell myself, okay, when the anxiety and the panic inevitably starts to set in, just remind yourself this is the coffee. This isn't based in anything going on in real life. It's the coffee. Because I was trying to build my tolerance. It's very annoying to not be able to handle caffeine. But I think in 2025, I've accepted that that's just not me. Caffeine is making my life worse. It's disrupting my sleep. I do still enjoy a Coke Zero or a Diet Coke on occasion, but those have much less caffeine than a latte. But the caffeine, I just don't know what I was trying to prove. I don't know why I was trying to do that. I think I've just been annoyed at myself for being such a wuss when it comes to caffeine, but I've accepted myself now. So decaf lattes. Another one of my favorites is Reformer. Super niche, I know, but truly I have been loving Pilates. I've been loving mat Pilates. I'm using Alo Moves at the moment so I can do mat Pilates at home. My gym also offers mat Pilates free of charge, like included in the gym membership, so that's nice. Reformer is a bit of an extra fee at my gym, but I have been just loving Pilates and especially Reformer Pilates. I can tell a real difference in my strength even just from like 2 months of being consistent with my Pilates practice. I am more toned. I can tell that my muscles are growing. I feel good. It's difficult, but it's not so difficult that I get mad at myself for not being able to do it, if that makes sense. It's a challenge, but it's doable. I'm getting to the point now where I'm not getting as sore after each class. So that's also helpful because when I started, I was getting so sore that it would make the rest of my day and the next 2 days difficult and I would have more water retention from my muscles being so sore. But now I'm getting to the point where I'm getting strong enough that that's not so much the case for me. And that's taken about 2 months of being consistent. And also, I think reformer is fun. Once I mastered my balance and how to use the machine, I started really enjoying it because it makes working out a little bit more fun. I like push myself up and down the moving platform and I'm like, wee! And along with getting into Pilates comes getting into Pilates socks. You don't have to have special little grippy socks to do Pilates, but I love a fun accessory, and wearing a cute sock makes me even more excited to do it. So that's another one. Another favorite is my Longchamp Le Pliage tote. I was influenced to buy this through social media, but I have to say I have had no regrets. I wear it constantly. I take it everywhere. I take it to the gym. It's like both my gym bag and my work bag. I carried it with me to the studio today. It fits my laptop. I've like taken it on planes. It's a personal item. I use it constantly for everything. It's one of the best totes I've ever used. I love the material. I love how chic it looks. I have a navy blue one. I love the color. So that's a favorite. And again, I was influenced to buy it and I wasn't sure if it was going to be worth the hype, but I decided, everyone's got one. People say that they absolutely love it and they last like 10 plus years. So I'll just get one. And I have not regretted it for a second. I'll never sit here and tell you guys that you absolutely have to have something, because most of the time you don't, but I will share my recommendations with you. And I love that tote. Okay, let me see. Another favorite is short nails. I got my long acrylics taken off so that I could play piano more easily. And I feel a little bit insecure about my fingers. I have small hands, and not in a pick me way. I just genuinely have very tiny, for my height, I'm 5'9". My hands are like weirdly small and my fingers are very short and a little bit chubby. And I have always felt like long nails elongates my hands and make them look just a little bit more elegant. So from that sense, I don't love having the short nails, but I can't deny I can type so fast. I can type 95 words a minute with short nails. I think that's fast. I want to be told that that's fast. I don't know. I don't know how that compares to the average, but with no acrylics, I can type 95 words a minute, and I'm really proud of myself for that. And of course, I can play piano, and so they do chip. I'm getting gel nail polish, and they still, like, it's been 2 weeks since I had them done. Has it been 2 weeks? No, not even. It's been a week and a half, and they're already chipped. So that's annoying because acrylics will last like a month plus. But I feel like I have such better control over my hands, and I feel more capable. So that's been a favorite. And then my last favorite has been cardigans. I've been loving a cardigan. I don't know why. I think my sweater game in general has upped since I moved to Scotland, especially this winter because it's so cold all the time. But lately, my preferred sweater has been a simple cardigan with a minimal chain necklace, a pair of jeans, like a headband like I'm wearing now. I think it's so chic and elegant without aging myself too much. I have a list on my phone of cashmere cardigans that I want to buy. The 2 cardigans that I have right now are not cashmere. They're like wool and acrylic blends, but I've been getting into the world of cashmere recommendations, and cashmere cardigans are a clothing item that I think is going to define the second half of my 20s. So those are my favorites. I just haven't done a favorites list in a while, and I love hearing people's current favorites. It's so reflective of what you're going through in your life at the moment. I love hearing them, and I hope you guys enjoyed hearing mine, especially the specific vlogs and specific podcast episodes. I feel like people will recommend vloggers or podcasters, but then they don't tell me where to start. And it's very overwhelming because how do I know what the best episode is? How do I know which post will give me a good sense of them and their vibe and their content? So that's why I gave you a specific vlog and a specific episode to listen to. Let me know if you liked that, because it's also easy because I can just jot that down during the week when I watch something or listen to something that resonates with me. So those are my current favorites. Now I want to get into today's topic. This episode was inspired by a situation that's not even relevant anymore, but I still wanted to share the biggest lessons that I've learned from therapy. So a little backstory. In December, my therapist that I've had for several years informed me that she was pivoting in her career. She would no longer be working for the practice that I was a client at. And so we very sadly had our last session in mid-December. I made a TikTok about it. You may have seen it. I just talked about my emotions going through that. I was so happy for her, 100% supported her. I was also grieving the loss of that therapist-patient relationship. And I talked about feeling so afraid to start over and so nervous because when you start with a new therapist, you have so much to tell them. There's so much backstory, so much lore. It can be emotionally difficult to recap the most traumatic experiences of your life. You have to catch them up on a whole cast of characters. And also, when you're with a therapist for multiple years, they also see you go through so many things. So, my therapist also was there with me, speaking to me every single week during some of the hardest moments of my life. And so, for all of those reasons, I was just sad. And again, I completely supported her, was so happy for her. But I was just sad, and it made me think a lot about the lessons that I learned from her, everything that I had picked up from therapy in the last few years. I genuinely feel like without my therapist, I would not have made it through the last 3 years. And my biggest feeling was one of overwhelming gratitude. And that's what inspired this episode, which is the biggest lessons that I've taken away from therapy. I did get an email last week from my therapist saying that she would take me on again. Just a little context, because I've gotten some questions about this. Most therapists are licensed in a state, and so they have to practice within that state. So you guys have understandably asked me, how am I still seeing the same therapist when I move countries? So I hired her services on as a life coach. So she's a licensed therapist, but I technically hired her as a life coach so that it would still be legal and ethical for her to work with me outside of the state where she is licensed. So she did email me last week and was like, well, because we already have this arrangement, we can still work together. And oh my God, I'm so excited. I was really not looking forward to starting over. I didn't want to start with somebody new. I didn't know whether I felt like I was going to have to start with someone in Scotland, but that was very daunting because a lot of what I talk about in therapy is my religious trauma. And I felt like I needed an American therapist, or at least someone who was really familiar with the particular brand of American Southern evangelicalism that I was talking about in order to get me. So I was like, I feel like I need to start working with someone in Scotland, but will they really understand what I'm talking about as well as someone who's familiar with religion in the United States? And so that was very daunting for me. I just wasn't looking forward to all of it. And I had actually resigned myself to just not having a therapist for a while and giving myself space to figure it out, which wasn't looking forward to because I need to be in therapy. Like, things are not okay up here. I need to be in therapy. So when I got that email last week, I was so excited. And so now the topic of today's episode, like everything that inspired today's episode, is kind of a moot point, but I'm still going to do it because if you are someone who is not able to go to therapy or who doesn't have access to therapy, I'm hoping that me sharing these main takeaways from the last couple of years can resonate with you, maybe provide you some insight into what you might speak about in therapy or just speak to you in your life in general. I had written out this long intro talking about not being with my therapist anymore and basically a more in-depth version of what I just said. And that's why I did the favorites in the intro for today's episode, because I was like, well, I have to scratch that because that's not relevant anymore. But still, I've written down my biggest takeaways. So obviously in therapy, you might discuss different circumstances and different events every week, but there's usually some common threads holding your mental health together and holding your journey together. And these are mine. These are the areas that I need to work on the most. These are topics that have come up again and again and again over the last several years. These are the lessons that I've continually had to learn, the areas I've continually had to work on. Everybody's therapy journey looks different because everyone's gone through different things. So this is what has spoken to me. I'm hoping it will speak to some of you. But if you're listening to this and you're like, well, none of this applies to me in my journey, I've never talked about any of this in therapy, maybe some of these could be topics to bring up, or maybe this just doesn't resonate with you, and either is fine. So the first lesson that I've really had to learn, probably the most repeated word and phrase that my therapist has said to me over the years, is duality. And holding space for multiple things, allowing multiple things to be true at once. This is one of the most frequent topics in my therapy sessions. When she first introduced this idea to me, it was very difficult for me to grapple with because I think as humans, we want to think in black and white. I think that's also a neurodivergent tendency. Don't quote me on that. But it's tempting to want to think in black and white. It's tempting to think if someone has wronged me, they are a bad person. Or if I have done something wrong, I am a bad person. Black and white thinking can stop you from empathizing with other people and understanding or trying to understand why they do the things they do. But it can also cause you to be so harsh on yourself. It's made me black and white thinking has made me feel things like, well, for example, if I'm grateful that I've moved countries, then I can't be sad about it. Or if I really disliked and struggled and was traumatized by this aspect of my childhood, then I need to be mad at my parents and there's no redemption for them and my childhood was bad. Those are examples of black and white thinking and patterns that I have fallen into in the past it's very hard to overcome. So I remember so distinctly the first time that my therapist brought up this idea of duality, and it was in the spring of 2023. I think it was right around the time that Matthew moved to Dallas, actually. I remember those two events are connected in my mind somehow. I can't remember the exact life event we were talking about when she brought it up, but I remember just thinking about this concept really deeply for the first time and it rocking my world because I felt like for the first time someone was giving me permission to hold space for two things at once. I know holding space is like a haha internet term right now. It's something that I say in therapy all the time, but allowing multiple truths. This is also something I've struggled with as someone who was raised in religion because, at least in Pentecostalism, you're raised with the idea that there is only one truth. There is only one way of looking at the world. Everything else is evil, everything else is wrong. A defining characteristic in my therapy sessions is realizing that so many of my beliefs and so much of my worldview, even though I've deconstructed from religion for almost 9 years now, so much of my beliefs were still shaped by religion in ways that I wouldn't even know until I began to unpack them. And this is an example because I was raised from birth believing that there was one truth, one way of looking at the world, and everything else is wrong. And I grew up believing there was a concept of ultimate truth. Even though I've deconstructed from religion, I've still carried that belief with me into my adulthood that only one thing can be true at once. And that's not true. Allowing multiple things to be true at once does not negate the validity of any of them. But this is hard. It's especially hard when you apply this concept to other people's actions because when someone wrongs me or hurts me, my initial inclination is to write them off completely and to think they are a bad person with bad motivations. But that's not true. Most people aren't bad people. And just because someone has hurt me or done wrong by me, one, they may have had a reason. Two, they probably deserve my empathy, but that goes against my tendency, my defensive tendency, my self-protective tendency. But when you learn how to give empathy to other people and to try to understand their actions, you can also learn to give empathy to yourself to understand your own. So examples of multiple things being true at once. I was deeply traumatized by my upbringing in religion, and my parents did the absolute best they could, and I still had loads of wonderful, joyful, happy aspects in my childhood. That's a key part when you start to juggle duality is and statements. I have bipolar disorder and obsessive compulsive disorder, and I can have a fulfilled, enriched, pleasant, content life. Maybe not 100% of the time, but overall, I can have that. I struggle with productivity and I'm a hard worker. It's these and statements that really exemplify holding space for two things, allowing multiple things to be true at once for me. And it is a practice that I have to work at every single day. Like I said, this goes against my nature, but it's been enormously helpful for me in therapy because once I start to fall back into that pattern of black and white thinking, my therapist will remind me two things at once. And I would say the biggest side effect from this is expanding my empathy. And my empathy has helped me not hold bitterness in my heart towards other people. It has helped me see the world a little bit more softly and interact with the world in a more understanding way. I think it's helped me in my friendships because it's made me less reactive. You know, there's been loads of times in just interpersonal relationships in the last couple of years where someone has done something that I don't like. I think before my tendency would just be to write off that relationship or to immediately withdraw, close myself off, not trust them anymore, question their intentions, question their character. And that's not fair. Everyone deserves grace because I make mistakes too. And if I want grace from other people, I need to give grace to those around me. So now I had something happen to me last week where a friend did something that I just didn't love. It didn't sit amazingly well with me. And instead of getting reactive and instead of getting defensive, I really tried to think, why have they done this? Why have they said this? And once I sat with that for a while, and I was really trying to understand, really trying to get into their head and see the situation through their eyes and understand why. And because I worked very hard at doing that, I feel like I reacted really well and I just gave them some space and grace, and everything ended up resolving beautifully. We had a nice talk. I think we both felt reassured and closer to one another, and it was the best possible outcome. But I wouldn't have been able to do that if I had not held space for one, this person upset me, and two, they're not a bad person. They probably had some reason why they said what they said, something going on in their head or their life that made them react a certain way. They hurt me and they're my friend and I know they're a good person and I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt and we're going to talk about it and I'm going to say my piece, but I'm going to have understanding and forgiveness. So duality has helped me release bitterness and release like the tendency to hold grudges. And for that reason, I think this is one of the best things that I've gotten out of therapy. I kind of touched on this already, but grace to others and myself. You will just wallow in self-loathing forever if you don't give yourself grace. And also, it's kind of narcissistic and ego-driven when you really think about it, to think that you're the worst person ever. Because why are you thinking about yourself so much? You are spending too much time thinking about yourself if you're spiraling and overthinking so hard about your own actions that you actually convince yourself that you're the worst person ever. And listen, I have OCD, I have anxiety, so I get it. I do this all the time. I pick apart my own actions. I analyze myself to death. I'm very hard on myself. My therapist, my husband, all my close friends, my parents have all told me at different points in my life that I'm a person who is very, very, very hard on myself. Learning to give myself grace and forgiveness has been difficult, but I feel like being too hard on yourself limits your growth. If you want to grow, you inevitably are going to fail, make mistakes, fall short of your own expectations. And you can either let that destroy you, or you can just take the experience, learn from it, put it to the side, and move forward. Another big lesson that I've learned through therapy is that the body remembers. Trauma is stored in the body. So if you've read the book, The Body Keeps the Score, then you already know what I'm speaking about right now. But something that I learned in therapy, because my therapist is trauma informed, is how trauma is processed in the brain and in the body. And a really helpful tip that I've gotten through therapy is that when you are in the middle of a traumatic time of life, maybe a traumatic event has just happened, if you can immediately start moving your body and sort of completing this physical process, it will help your brain store that memory and that experience in a less traumatic way. So say you are in a car crash, or you have a near miss with a car accident. I'm using this as an example because I've been in a car accident, a bad one that I got a lot of trauma from, so I know what this feels like. After my car accident, my body was buzzing with adrenaline and with, it felt like electricity. I was just jittery, and I was vibrating almost with all of this pent up energy in my body. If I had known then what I know now, and if I had had the capacity to do so, I would have done something physical to expel that excess adrenaline. How I apply this in my life currently is that right now, my trauma therapy sessions are a pretty regular, reoccurring instance in my life where I'm accessing trauma, and it's agitating. I feel unsettled. It's very difficult to bring up old memories to try to work through them. I just feel on edge afterwards. Going for a long walk or a run, going to the gym, taking the dog out, something physical, doing jumping jacks, even just shaking my hands like this helps me process. This is a tip my therapist gave me close to the start of our sessions, I think. I think she could tell that some of our earlier sessions where we were really getting into my religious trauma for the first time were unsettling me very deeply. I threw up after my first therapy session where I talked about my religious trauma, because there was so much going on in my body. But she really taught me how to get out of my head and into my body. And it doesn't have to just be about trauma. This also works for anxiety. I made a podcast episode last year called the what is it called? The opposite of anxiety is action, I believe. And I talked about this idea of getting out of your head and into your body. Physical activity helps you process difficult emotions. I have applied this technique countless times over the last couple of years, and it helps. I actually saw this TikTok comment a few days ago. I don't know if this is true, so grain of salt, but I saw this comment that said research has shown that playing Tetris after a traumatic event helps your brain process and organize and store that information in a more ordered, less traumatic way. Again, I haven't looked that up for myself, so that could be totally wrong. But the principle of doing something, not distracting yourself in the sense that you are bottling it up or not allowing yourself to feel it, but distracting yourself in the sense that you're giving your body an outlet, very helpful. I will link some articles about exercises you can do to release trauma stored in your body in the show notes if you're interested in learning about this. The Body Keeps the Score. I'm sure you've heard of it. It's a very popular book that talks about this topic. It also talks about how generational trauma can be stored in the body. So if you want to do some reading, I will link that down below. But if nothing else, a takeaway here is that you need to get out of your head and into your body when you're experiencing anxiety. If you feel like you've just had a traumatic event, so again, that's why I gave the car accident as an example. And I was so traumatized from my car accident that I don't think I could have done that in the moment, but I have applied this principle after other traumatizing events like driving, because I have a lot of driving anxiety now, and I I have like PTSD when I'm in the car, especially when I'm driving, that gets triggered. This car accident was so bad, you guys. It was I totaled my car. I basically hit a semi truck. We were going 60 miles an hour, completely totaled my car, and I have had driving anxiety ever since. It's really, really bad. In fact, I haven't driven on a real road. I don't even know how long. It's not so bad in the country where it's quieter, and the feeling of driving in the country is much more familiar to me. Like, I would rather deal with a windy gravel road and the possibility of deer jumping out than deal with driving on the highway. So it's not quite so bad in the country, but I still just have a lot of driving anxiety in general. And so all of the most recent times that I have driven, I have immediately done something physical afterwards to help my body and my mind put things back in order. So that's a really helpful tip that I've learned in therapy. Another one, it's all connected. It's all connected. I feel like when people think about therapy, there's this stereotype that you get into therapy and you just blame your childhood for everything. And people go to therapy for different reasons. I do have a lot of childhood things to unpack in therapy. And my biggest takeaway is it really is all connected. Even from what I said earlier about, not even realizing that I grew up thinking there was one ultimate truth. And because of that, I have a difficult time holding space for multiple things. That's just one example, but I have a million examples like that. My relationship with money was shaped by religion. There's that Bible verse that says it's easier for a camel to enter through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to go to heaven. And so as someone who is self-employed and has to have a really tight relationship with their finances and managing their finances, I have hangups about money. I have limitations in my mind when it comes to money. I have anxiety about money because I was raised with that mindset. I have had difficulty finding my independence as a woman because I grew up being told I grew up being explicitly told by many different people in the church. And I know I'm talking about religion a lot, and if you are a practicing Christian, I am not trying to come for you or your faith. I support you in your faith. I can only speak about my experiences, and my specific experiences were deeply negative, but I do support you in your faith. But I was explicitly told by many, many, many people in the church growing up that my job, my purpose in life as a woman was to get married young, immediately have children, and obey my husband in all things. That was my purpose. That was my highest calling. There could be no greater aspiration. There could be no more fulfilling, no more enriching way to spend my entire life than being a housewife and being a mother to multiple children and to obey my husband in all things. If that's the path that you've chosen, I support you because I believe that we all get a choice. If that's your choice, I support your choice. I was not presented with the idea that I had a choice. There was no choice. And even though I strongly disagree with that notion now, I know that I'm like not going to promise to obey a man ever. Are you kidding me? But two, I know that for myself in my life, I think I am walking more in my purpose, being someone who's entrepreneurial, having my own business, being someone who cares about career. That was not presented as an option to me growing up, but it's something I believe in strongly now. But even so, I've had to work really hard at unpacking the messaging that I received about being a woman and my place in the world because of my upbringing. So it's all connected. I can't even tell you how many times in therapy I have been working through an issue that I'm having or a frustration that I'm having, and then either I or my therapist all of a sudden will be able to connect it back to one of those like worldview shaping experiences, situations, beliefs that I was exposed to in childhood. One of the first things I learned in therapy is that ages 0 to 7 are our true formative years, and the beliefs that we're exposed to, the ideas that we're exposed to in our early childhood have the potential to shape your entire adult life. Terrifying. Really terrifying. But it's almost like a treasure hunt though, because when you start to pick those threads apart and you start to unravel the tapestry in your mind and you start to follow a connection all the way back through your adult years, your adolescence, your childhood, and you find the cause, it's very rewarding and it can make you feel less crazy. It's all connected. Now, I'm not sure what the practical application of this idea is. All I know is that this idea has been significant to me. Let me think. It probably has allowed me to give myself grace. It does give me deeper insight into my own brain. And I do think that you can't work to unpack something and you can't work through something until you understand where it's coming from. So maybe that's the practical application. I'm not sure. Have a think about it. See if that resonates with you. And then my last main takeaway from therapy over the last few years is that you are constantly mourning past versions of yourself. Life is a cycle of getting to a point, processing, working through, unpacking, leveling up, continuing forward. And as you continue forward, reaching a point where you have an even deeper and an even greater level of understanding into something in your past, working through, processing, understanding that new level, getting through it, moving forward, and so on and so forth. So if you can see me on video right now, it's almost like going in a ascending spiral. So you are moving upwards and you're moving forward, but at the same time, you're re-navigating all these areas of life. And it's not a bad thing. It doesn't mean that you are taking steps backward. It doesn't mean that you're stuck on the past. It's just that the more you grow and the more you expand, the more insight you unlock. And part of that is always mourning this past version of yourself. But it's a good thing because having multiple past selves means you are constantly growing. Right now, I am mourning the version of myself that lived in Arlington, Virginia. Why did my voice just crack then? I am mourning that girl. I am mourning the life that I had. I am mourning my routine. I'm mourning. And mourning doesn't always mean that you wish you could go back. Like, that's not what it means for me right now. Mourning and grieving doesn't mean that you want to go back. It just means you recognize that that part of your life is over and you'll never be the same again. You'll never be that person again. And it's taking a second to honor the place that that version of yourself had in your journey. Honor the fact that if it wasn't for that version, you wouldn't be where you are now. But it's constant because we're constantly growing, or at least we should be. Right now, I'm mourning that girl in Arlington. Another example would be when we got our dog. I had to mourn the version of my life that existed without that added responsibility. And you guys know how obsessed I am with Fergus. I would never in a million years give Fergus up. I don't regret bringing him home for 1 second. But my life changed because I had this added responsibility and I mourned the version of my life with no responsibilities. When you get into a new relationship, you mourn your single self. And again, mourning, I feel like it has this really negative connotation. You could also say honoring a past version of yourself. I do kind of approach it with just a tinge of sadness. But again, sadness doesn't mean you wish it wasn't happening. I think I just get really overly emotional and like really attached to different eras of my life. Growth can be so bittersweet. So I don't wish that I was single and living with my girlfriends again. Like I wouldn't go back to that if given the choice right now. I wouldn't go back. I wouldn't not get into a relationship, etc. But you can still create a little space in your heart for the time in your life where you were single and living with your girlfriends, and you can be like, you know what, that was the best, and it helped get me to where I am today. But I have to say goodbye to that. I have to formally end that chapter. I have to process it, and we're just always doing that. We're doing that constantly. And that's not a bad thing. I guess that's the takeaway, is that it's not a bad thing. And also the visual of moving in that ascending spiral has been helpful for me as well, because also sometimes I will find myself unlocking a new layer of insight into something that happened in my past. And my inclination will be like, oh, well, I'm not over it. That's not true. The deeper I get into my marriage, into my relationship, the more insight I have into why past relationships didn't work out. Because the more I learn about myself and my relationship style, the more I can see the cracks in the relationships that I had before. It doesn't mean that I'm not over those relationships. Of course, I'm over those relationships. It just means I have more understanding. And sometimes you realize something difficult. Sometimes unlocking a new layer of understanding means realizing like, oh, you know what, that thing that happened to me, that was actually really messed up. And I didn't realize it until this moment because I hadn't grown enough to see it. That's happened to me a lot as well. Not like specifically with sort of, but not just with relationships, with lots of circumstances in life in general. I'll look back and I'll be like, oh, that was actually really messed up. But I needed to grow to a point where I could even see it. And now that I see it, I can process it. But it doesn't mean you're not over it. It doesn't mean you want to go back. It just means life is a never-ending cycle. Everything always comes back around. So those are my top takeaways from the last several years of therapy. I'm excited to do another installment in this episode series. We should make it a series, maybe in another year, maybe even in 6 months once I have some new insights. But I sat down and I wrote these down and I really reflected. Sometimes I take notes in therapy. I often read book recommendations from my therapist. I really thought about this one, you guys. You're getting, this is very vulnerable of me because you're really getting some insight into the things that I speak about in my therapy sessions. I can't even tell you how relieved I am that my therapist will take me on as a a client for her life coaching again. So that just means that I'm going to have more to talk about 6 months, a year, 2 years from now. I'll make another episode and I'll tell you some more things. I'm assuming that as I continue to work through therapy and process things, the topics of our sessions will evolve. Although I have to say, these are the topics that come up over and over and over and over again, and maybe they always will. Either way, I really hope that you enjoyed this episode and took something from it. Maybe you have a topic you'd like to bring up in your next therapy session. If you don't go to therapy, maybe you could even use this as a journal prompt. I hope it gave you something to mull over in your next thought daughter introspection session. With all of that being said, thank you for spending your Monday morning with me, and I will talk to you next week.